Hi, I am Katie Weber. I am a project archivist with the Houston Jewish History Archives located at Rice University, and I am here today talking to Linda Berger. Linda, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Katie. Hi, I'm Linda Berger, and I am currently the CEO of Jewish Family Service. I'm just about to celebrate my 15 years there as CEO.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited it's just me. I'm really excited to hear from you and hear about uh, your whole history and your experiences in Texas and Houston. So to start that off, I would love if you could tell me about your family history and how your family came to be in Texas.
It's a pleasure, and just like to say that today happens to be the anniversary of my mother's sixth yard site, the day of her death. And I feel so honored to be talking about her family and my family today. So I do it with her in mind. And thank you for selecting this day. Most of our family came to the United States in the late 1800s and entered into the ports that you would expect, like Ellis Island, some through Baltimore, some through Galveston. But because they came in the 1880s and 1890s, my grandparents were all born in this country. And by the time they were born, most of them were already in Texas. And I thought in memory and in honor of my mom, I would talk about her family specifically. My great-grandfather, Max, her father, was born in Chicago and he was not born in Chicago. He was born in Bialystok in 1880, and he came through Baltimore to Chicago in 1898. Why did he go to Chicago? I don't know the answer to that, but that's where he came. And he was already married at that time and was going to send for his wife and first child that was already born. It's my grandfather, A. Milton Feinberg, who was born in Chicago. And he came to Beaumont because he heard from an uncle of his that was living in Beaumont that opportunities were really great. It was around the time of Spindletop in the 1900s, and so all along the way, he picked up scrap from the oil fields and peddled it as he was making his way to Beaumont. And what's neat about my great-grandfather and his family is that they really were the beginning of the Jewish community in Beaumont. My great-grandfather Max would ride his horse and buggy into Houston every month or so to pick up kosher meat so that the Jewish community would have access to kosher food. At some point when he was a little more successful, he sent away for my great-grandmother's brother who also lived in Bialystok. They mostly came from that area. Sometimes it was called Russia, sometimes it was called Poland, depending on the year. But he was a shochet. He was a ritual slaughterer, and so they brought my great uncle to Beaumont so that they would no longer have to make that trek back and forth by horse and buggy to Beaumont. So that's something that he did. I also learned that he was part of the community leadership that purchased a home for the Jewish community to have their first synagogue in Beaumont. Years later, when my grandfather Milton Feinberg was a little older and out of college, he wrote a lot of letters to my grandmother, who was born in Tyler, Texas. And they met because my grandmother Bonnie's brother married a Beaumont girl and moved to Beaumont. And so that's kind of how those things were happening in those days. Anyways, my grandfather wrote all these love letters to my grandmother before they got married. And I've been fortunate enough to have in my possession about 3 years worth of those letters, which happened to be during this time. And one thing I learned is that he lived in the Hotel Beaumont as a young adult before he was married. And that's something I didn't know, but all the letters were coming off of that letterhead, and it made a lot of sense because there were 7 kids in the family. Only 6 actually survived it to adulthood, but I imagine it was a pretty full house. And once you left for college, I'm not sure they expected you back. In one of the letters, he talked about going with his father to an event at the Rice Hotel in Houston that was for the Jewish community. And he said in the letter, there were about 1,000 people there, which was really an interesting moment. I've been to a few events in my time where there have been 1,000 people gathered for the Jewish community. And even if he was, let's say, exaggerating or estimating up, what if there were 500 or 600 or 700? It was kind of amazing to think of that many people coming together for a Jewish event in the 1928s, 29s, and at the Rice Hotel. And he said that his father really made him go from one table to another to speak to everybody and work the room. And why I found that so funny is that one year when my mom was visiting here in Houston and we had an event at one of the synagogues, as I was leaving and she was waiting for me, she said, I figured out you're just like your grandfather, my father. He really knew how to work a room. So now I know he learned that from his father. And anyways, we really do love working rooms. So that was kind of a cute story that I never would have known if I hadn't seen these letters. During the time that he was doing the scrap business, he did send a cousin, or he sent a nephew to El Paso to start a scrap business there. Now, in those days when they were very early in Beaumont doing this work in the scrap business, he said it was a really rough time. He even bought a revolver for my grandmother to keep at home in case she needed to protect herself. So it's kind of a different time than we know of now. At some point, he transitioned into dry goods, and he ended up having this wonderful dry goods store in Beaumont where they sold everything. It reminded me more, I wouldn't just say dry goods, it reminded me more of a department store where you could get, wedding dresses and you could get things to use in the kitchen. And as the Depression years were coming and things were so bad, he decided to open a kitchen in the store so that people could come in for very little money to buy a lunch. I think I saw something that a nickel bought you, a full meal. And it was also a marketing strategy because if you came in for lunch, you might see something you wanted to buy on the way out. So he seemed to have a really good sales intuition. Anyways, I think times during the Depression were really, really hard. His oldest son, Sam was also born in Bialystok and came with his mother to the States, as I told you earlier. He he poisoned himself because he had a life insurance policy and he thought that would help the family at that time. And they say that my grandfather Max never got over that. And my story tells me that 2 years to the day, Max also died by suicide by throwing himself in front of a train. I don't know if it was exactly 2 days, but I can say that the death certificates are 2 days apart from each other. And the tragedy of that, of course, is for any family to have to live through one, much less two. But most of the family who were still under mothers, their mothers went with her to New York, and my grandfather and my grandmother went to El Paso, and they joined the scrap business that my great-grandfather had sent his nephew to begin. And so once they came to El Paso, so did all of the siblings except one eventually. So the Feinberg clan ended up primarily in El Paso, and again, significant parts of both of the Jewish community, both the Reform and the Conservative. Everybody in those days kept kosher. By the way, it wasn't like a thing who keeps and who doesn't. If you were Jewish, you kept kosher. So when they all came to El Paso, they also kept kosher. There's a cute story about they say that my grandfather, Milton Feinberg, got sick within the first 3 years of moving to El Paso. And his doctor told my grandmother that if she fed him some pork product, like bacon, that he would get better. And so they like to say that once the trafe made it into the house, it never left. So that's kind of a cute story they shared with me many years ago. My dad was born in El Paso, and his father was from Chicago. It's interesting. I don't know if the two families ever met in Chicago, but they both ended up in El Paso. And my dad, once he got married, went into the scrap business as well. And actually they split off, and it was no longer just a scrap business, but also a pipe and supply business. And my grandfather and my dad and my uncle were in that business until about 1969. I may be off by a year or two, maybe 68. But until that time, it was a huge family business. The cousins are still in that business in El Paso.
Wow. Wow. Well, thank you for that colorful family history. It just, touches so much of what we know about small town Jewish life in Texas. So I'm glad that you're helping us add to that tapestry of knowledge.
And I think if I could just share with you about growing up and being part of a vibrant Jewish community of El Paso, there's a lot of things that I attribute to growing up there. First, it was just this lovely, lovely small city to raise a family in. It was always diverse. It was always, because it was on the border with Juarez, Mexico, there was a lot of back and forth, and there were lots of members of the Jewish community who had businesses right across the border. I remember a lot of jewelry and kind of gift kinds of things, restaurants, and we went back and forth across that border so many times without any thought about it. I know today it's a little different, but I would just say we kind of saw it as one big city, and it was pretty exciting as a little girl to have to say, U.S. When you went back across the border, and we were afraid. What if they didn't believe us as we told the immigration people who we were? But from a Jewish point of view, the Jewish community was small. A number I have in my head, and I don't know when it grew this big, and there are historians that will be much smarter than me on this, but I remember there being about 1,500 families total in the El Paso area most of the time I was growing up. There was a Reformed synagogue, Temple Mount Sinai, and there still is. And there was a conservative synagogue, B'nai Zion, and there still is. There was also a chaplain that was on the Fort Bliss Army base, and a Jewish chapel there. And sometimes we would go out there for services as well. And Jewish soldiers were always welcome in our home, my grandmother's home, in many people's homes for all the holidays. And there are a lot of cute stories I hear from people in Houston who met in El Paso. Maybe one of them went to University of Texas, which at that time was probably called the Texas College of Mines, or a different name, but they met there and would be stationed at Fort Bliss. So very cohesive Jewish community. Some of the Jews that came to El Paso through Mexico. And I know my brother-in-law's family, the Marcus family, they were originally from Syria, and I don't know the details of their story other than they came from Syria through Mexico, and many of their family are still in Mexico City, and of course my brother-in-law and his family are now in El Paso. There were also Spanish Jews or Mexican Jews that were part of our growing up in the youth groups and things like that. Some things that I think are really important that kind of framed why the Jewish part spoke to me. Look, I was born just a few years after the state of Israel became a nation. Many Holocaust survivors ended up in El Paso, and so there was certainly that undercurrent, and I call it an undercurrent because as a very young child, I never heard stories. As I got a little bit older, I knew, for example, that our wonderful across the street neighbor, Larry Gladstone, had been in a camp, and he was from Hungary, and I knew many members of his family, and therefore many of them were impacted, but I never once had a conversation with him about the war. We never talked about surviving, and we never talked about it with his children. It was much more a very quiet thing that said, I guess, almost like with whispers. But it was there. And a lot of the kids my age, as they grew older, Israel really was important, whether it was through Young Judea or any other organization that was really connected to Israel. I shared with you at one time that several people of my age group became Jewish communal professionals and who have been working for the national organizations like Michael Novick, who is working for the Joint Distribution Committee. And before that, he was the Federation Director for the Jewish Federation in Seattle. And Russell Robinson, who worked for United Jewish Appeal for many years and then became the CEO and president of Jewish National Fund worldwide. And then me, who stayed in Houston, but always committed to the Jewish community. But there were also at least a dozen of our peers that we grew up with who made Aliyah to Israel either right after high school or right after college and have stayed there all these years. So I do remember when I was 3 years old, I was in nursery school, and I was Queen Esther in the Purim parade, and King Ahasuerus was my friend Jimmy Goldfarb. And one day I was traveling through Israel as an adult, and I end up at this kibbutz, and somebody says from the kibbutz, anybody here from Texas? Do you happen to know anyone in El Paso? And I'm like, well, I'm from El Paso. And they said, oh my gosh, my husband, Jimmy Goldfarb, is from El Paso. And so she ran to find him, and we got to reconnect. And I said, I found King Ahasuerus, at Moshava in Israel. So truly, my group really just had this infusion that I don't know where it came from. Some people say El Paso has lithium in the water. Maybe it came from that. I don't know, but we are a supercharged Jewish group of peers, and it's pretty cool.
Wonderful. That's so funny. Such a funny story.
Yeah.
I wondered, so you are a Jewish professional and have been for a long time, and so many of your peers are. I was wondering if you could talk about your outside of your family, your early involvement in these sorts of Jewish organizations, and what was that like for you, and what were the sort of things that you were focused on in addition to Israel during that time?
Sure. Although I have to say, there were certain key things that happened I was 12 years old during the 6-Day War. And my memory of the 6-Day War is not, obviously we're really proud of Israel, but I was a volunteer at an outdoor sidewalk sale for a store, a department, store I loved. And I still remember one of my friend's mothers coming and just hysterical, saying, I need to buy winter clothes at this sidewalk sale. And she's just buying everything because my daughter, Jackie Wiener Margolis, is in Israel. And because of the 6-Day War, we were 12 years old. She was being sent to Switzerland by the government to get her out of the country. And so her mom was trying to figure out how to get her clothes that were warm enough to be there for that time. So that's like the little story I remember in addition to the big Israel stories. And the other thing, there were two other things that I think really impacted me greatly. One was Soviet Jewry, because in those years before 1970 is when we were trying to get people out of what was then called Russia. And, youth groups and at Sunday school and other places, we were really focused on that. And I got really, I was just imagining one day being able to go there, and I would hear stories of young teenagers being brave and going there and what they found. And I couldn't imagine being that brave, but those are the stories that really start to make you think and care. And I think the other thing, which is not a Jewish thing, but it is, and that is Nostra Aetate, which was the Pope, the Pope. It is Vatican II, saying that he absolved all Jews of any accusation of deicide. And how silly! In 8th grade, I didn't know those words, probably, or however old I was. But what I do know is that my closest friends that weren't Jewish, they would go, we'd go away for Easter vacation, And when we would come back, all of a sudden they couldn't be my friends anymore because the Jews killed Christ in what they learned at church. And so these things were really significant in my own development, but also in how I chose to do. And then the other thing that was probably even as significant as all the youth groups I joined is that I won a camp scholarship. I was at Sunday school. I went every Sunday, and all of a sudden, it's the last day, and they say, my name, and you won a scholarship to Camp Swig in Saratoga, California, and it was in those days, Union of American Hebrew Congregations is what it was called for Reformed Jews, and there was a family in El Paso who funded these scholarships to send kids. I never would have been able to go. I mean, I was the oldest of four. My dad was no longer working in the family business. He had a illness that prevented him from being able to work. And my mom was making a living as a full-time teacher, supporting 4 children and a husband who couldn't work. So that gift to me transformed my life. I loved Camp Swig. And how did some kids went to Camp Hess Kramer. My siblings were the ones that went to Camp Hess Kramer, which was much more of a sports, Jewish, but still more sports. And Camp Swig was just so much more infused with Jewish learning, and the games we played were like the allocation game. It was called the Star Allocation Game, which was really impactful. And I actually have the book that was written by the man who created all these games that I ended up playing as a young child. But it was like your job is to make allocations to Holocaust, Israel, survivors, Israel, all these things, and you had to make decisions, and you voted by how many stars you gave to each. And you only had a certain number of stars, and so very early on, I really was impressed by the significance of Jewish communities and how they really work. So as soon as I was old enough, I belonged to the Misty, which was Mount Sinai Temple Youth Group. I was active at the United Synagogue Youth Group, even though I'm not sure that I was actually a member, but I went to all their things. As soon as I was old enough in the 8th grade, I was in the BBG world and BBYO, and I went from being a pledge, if you will, to being the regional president of BBG for Texas and Oklahoma. And so all of these things really were formative for me, and I don't know how I could have been anything else. My mom would drop me off at the JCC, and I would just practically live there. Part of it was she had 4 kids, all different ages. She could drop me off. I was in heaven. The Federation director and his wife, their names were Olga and Ollie Winkler, and Ollie was in charge of the Federation and the JCC, and Olga was in charge of Jewish Family Service. And she just, attached herself to me, and she gave me all of these opportunities, like we created a march for Soviet Jewry, and we brought all of the youth groups and other organizations together, and we marched from the synagogue to the JCC, and I got the opportunity to plan it and to be part of it. So there was every time there was a big Israel program, she had me as the youth person on the committee and talking to the media and just being so engaged. My mom never wanted me to go to Israel, so she let me go to Camp B'nai B'rith in Starlight, Pennsylvania, and I went there for all the leadership things. I went to Shreveport, Louisiana for the district leadership groups, and probably the most significant thing I remember as a young person is creating a little conclave in El Paso for the AZA and BBG, and my dad had friends at the phone company, and he got a speakerphone, which wasn't typical even in businesses, and he brought it to the JCC, and in the middle of the night, because we waited till it was daytime in Russia, we were able to call a man by the name of Alexander Tiemkin, and he had a daughter who was our age, and we already knew that they were trying to get out of Russia, and we didn't think about what language he was going to be able to speak, but we had to call the operator. The operator had to place the call for us. She had to call us back when the call was there. I mean, nothing was like it is today, where you could just go on WhatsApp and be connected. So everything was like a big deal and very exciting. And thank God, Olga Winkler spoke Hungarian, and so did Alexander Timkin. So they had a wonderful conversation, and she was able to tell him how young Jews in El Paso, Texas, really cared about them. And the only other little story about that is there was an organization nationally called Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry. It's no longer around, but it was. And I called them to order 200 T-shirts, that said that, and something else. And this young person probably, was probably like a college person. Who knows who I was talking to? He was so excited, and he said, tell me about El Paso, Texas. We've never had such a big order. And, but we got it. And so how can I have chosen a different life? I don't know. It's just what I love.
That's so wonderful. Yes, thank you for sharing all of that with me. It feels like we're just being formed in this like crucible of good Jewish experience as a young person, and how special. And to share that that's happening in Texas and all over, it has been. I wanted to know if you could tell me now about what happened, that if you could walk me through from being an adolescent who was so involved in Jewish life and Jewish organizations in El Paso to how you became a Jewish professional, and just kind of your, the different jobs that you have had on this career path.
Absolutely. So I knew that I wanted to be the head of a Jewish federation. That was my goal. That's what I felt, that all the things that I had learned about would put me. I could care about Israel, and I could care about everything. Soviet Jews, Judaism. And I went away for orientation at UT in Austin, And had a random roommate who I told her, well, this is what I want to do, but I don't know what undergraduate degree I'm going to get because I think I just have to have my master's in social work and I have to figure out how to get there. And she happened to come back from seeing some papers on a table that she looked at, and it was about this new program at UT for it was a 5-year undergraduate graduate program where you ultimately got your master's in social work. You did your undergraduate either in sociology or psychology, and then you took an extra 12 hours or 15 hours of social welfare studies. And for that, you got a certificate of completion. Well, I believe today you can get an undergraduate degree in social work at UT, but that was the beginning of that program. So, my first placements, I applied for that program. I went into it. I have this woman to thank. What I remember about her, besides she found me that, is that she took her jeans to the dry cleaner to be laundered and pressed, and I never heard of anybody doing that. So those are the two things I remember. And but she found me my path, and I, from day one, I was in the right place. For undergraduate, I did a field placement with UT Hillel and with what was then called Southwestern Texas State, which was today it's Texas State in San Marcos. And my job there was to create Jewish community with the students. And that was part of my Hillel assignment. And then the other part of my placement was with the Jewish Federation. And I learned so much from that. And when it was time to go to graduate school, I suggested that rather than doing it in the Jewish community, perhaps I should get some experience in the broader community. And the graduate school agreed. And I ended up doing my field placement with the state legislative budget board, which I really loved. And I learned a lot there. And of course, that's something I've been able to apply all my life. So I'm very, very lucky about it. I would have liked to have stayed in Austin. And if there had, so as everybody always has wanted to stay in Austin, if there had been a job at the legislative budget board, I probably would have stayed, I'm guessing. But because there wasn't, I chose Houston. And I chose Houston because I knew a lot of people from Houston. I was single and Jewish, and finding a Jewish partner was really important to me. And I just thought that I had a better chance on a dating scene in Houston than I might in El Paso. So I moved to Houston. I lived with one of my roommate's mothers in the very beginning until I found a job. I had a really hard time finding a job in the Jewish community. The Jewish Federation was located in the lobby of the JCC, not in the lobby, the basement of the JCC. And I met with Hans Mayer then, and other people like Marty Karp worked there then, and Suzanne Jacobson, but they didn't have any openings. So eventually I took a job after the second time they offered it to me. I finally went to Harris County Child Welfare, where I took custody of kids from birth to 7 years old. And I loved the job, although it was a little bit scary. You drove all over Harris County, no matter where. I got lost so many times, and there's no GPSs, and you would buy these big orange key map books, and, I got lost a lot, but you certainly learn the city inside out that way. And I would go into homes by myself and, oftentimes interview people about how they were treating their children. So, and then take them often, not usually from the parent, but from school or somewhere else. And what I found is I loved the job, but one day my phone rang and it was the JCC, a man named Neil Perlman who worked for Jerry Wishy. And Neil called and said he had a couple of jobs, one in senior adult work and one in adult work, and I forget one other one. So I said, okay, and I'll come interview. And I remember driving into the parking lot of the JCC and thinking, what am I doing here? I'm like so happy in my work. But I went in, and the job I interviewed for was called Adult Group Supervisor, I think. And I was to be in charge of all the adult programs. And that included singles programs as well as adults. And they didn't offer me very much money. And I will say that I was probably making $11,000 working for for Harris County Child Welfare with my big old master's degree. And they offered me $12,000. And I just thought, I'm happy. Why would I leave for so little money? So I said, thank you very much. And I turned it down and went back to work. And about 2 weeks later, I got a call saying that they had just heard I turned it down and what would I come there for? And I'm like, I hadn't thought about it. So I said $13,000. And I don't know if I could have asked for more or not. I have no idea. But by the time I got home that night, I had a new job. And as I went to work there, the person who was in charge of the singles programs for the JC had quit and moved to California. I mean, within a few weeks. And so rather than hire someone new, they just said, you'll do that too. And so immediately I was the new singles person for the Jewish community. And I was overwhelmed within the first few days of people calling and asking me out on dates because I was the new singles director. And I don't know where the wisdom came, but I just said, oh my gosh, I'm so flattered. Thank you so much for asking, but this is my work and I can't go out with people that I work, on behalf of. And I really want you to come to the program. So where that wisdom came, but it was my mantra and I pretty well kept to it for the years that I was there. My husband, Andy, he came to meet the new singles worker. I don't remember the first day he came. There were 150 singles. They came for a brunch to hear Rabbi Sherman speak about sex and being single. So there were a lot of people there, and Rabbi Sherman didn't show up. And I had 150 people who wanted to talk about sex. And I told my boss, I'm not talking about it, you do it. And what's funny is he did, and Joel Dinkin, who's now the head of the JCC, but we were both new people at the J. So Joel and Alan Yost spoke to everybody about that. And that's what I remember about my first day. There was no way. I was just happy. I knew what to say about not going out on dates. So that was my very first singles program. And we had one program with 1,500 singles that came. And just another reminder about the times. So when they signed up for 3 classes, we didn't have computers. I was literally having to do it by hand and schedule people and get them into all the rooms and do it manually. And that was a really big deal. I would be there till 2 or 3 in the morning. And often Jerry Wishy would be leaving late at night and he'd drop by my office and say, you're going home now. But it's how intense it was to just try and figure it out without computers and things like that. So I was at the JCC, and I didn't feel, honestly, that I was going to make it up the ladder very as quickly as I wanted. Today I have a lot of young people come work for me, and I think they went up the ladder a little too fast. I wasn't trying to go up the ladder faster than I thought I should, but I did think I should go as fast as, say, Joel or other people who were as new as I was. And it didn't feel like that was going to happen. And an opportunity came, and I went to the Jewish Herald-Voice, and I became their managing editor. And, I found out that even though it was a Jewish place, it was not me delivering services and doing the work in the way I wanted. So I did learn I learned to love the Samuels and the people who own the paper, and I learned to I think make a really big contribution there. It happened to be in the advent of the computer that came to the Herald while I was working there. But I was there just a little under 3 years, and then I went to the Jewish Federation, where I really thought I would be for the rest of my life. I got there in 1984. And realized 1 month after I was there that I was pregnant. And I remember saying to Hans Mayer, I have bad news and good news. What do you want first? And he said, the good news. I said, the good news is it's great for the Jewish people. And he said, what's the bad news? And I said, I'm pregnant. And so I worked there part-time from when I started there until after the baby was born, and then my baby Michael was born, and then I went back full-time in the campaign department, and I never looked back. I loved raising money for the Federation because it was for the Jewish community. It was about everything that I had ever worked on: Soviet Jewry, Israel, Jewish camps, people in need. It hit everything that mattered to me in the Jewish community. So I was there for 17 years and had a lot of different positions. Ultimately, I was Associate Executive Vice President of Development. Again, I thought they were going to find me one day, just frozen dead on the phone talking to people about money, because that's where I planned to be for my whole life. And but my husband had a career as well, and his business wanted him to go to France to integrate a business that he recommended that they purchase into their infrastructure. And he said, my wife will never go. And I said, in a minute, to take our kids to the south of France and to, have that life for a while. So literally, we found out in February of 2001, and by June of 2001, we were in France. And while we were there, we got very involved with the Jewish community. I actually got on their UJA committee, and I couldn't speak the language, so it was particularly humorous. But in our little town, Aix-en-Provence, there was a little cabinet of UJA folks, and they then took me to Marseille, to the big folks where we planned the regional fundraising event. And they would ask questions in English like, maybe your American friend will tell us exactly what they would do about this in the States, So what were their issues? How to make an event bigger and better than the year before? How to manage the mailing list so people didn't get more than one invitation, because it really makes people mad. How to decide what kind of alcohol to serve so that everybody feels they're getting the quality they want for the gift that they're giving. At any rate, I had a van. Nobody else had such a big van, but I did. So I drove the local people from Aix to Marseille for the big event. And it started at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, which would never happen in our community. And they had an hour of cocktails. They had, and then you had an hour of speakers and dinner. So now you're like at midnight. And then the band starts and the dancing and the everything. And so I told them that although many of the problems were exactly the same, I would get fired if I tried to create an event like that in the States. I don't think it would work. So anyways, Jewish communities are very similar. While we were living in France, it was 9/11 happened, as well as going into Afghanistan, and the mood of the country and the mood towards Jews changed significantly. And there were times where my husband wasn't allowed to be at big community events because of the corporate challenges. What we did do, though, is join 1,000,000 people in a march on behalf of Israel. We actually went to it in Paris, but that same walk happened in every Jewish community in France at the same time. So that's where the 1,000,000 came from. And their rallies are very different. It was in silence. We walked quietly. And so many people were telling me that they were planning to move to Israel from France. And it was really the beginning of a big exodus of the Jewish community to Israel, which I think is perhaps still happening today. So that was interesting times to be there. And let me just say one other thing about it. BBG, BBYO came to the rescue because one day my son, who was 16, came home and said that at the synagogue there was a sign that said BBYO trip to Marseille. And he signed up for it, and he was going to go. And first place, it was incredibly brave. Again, we didn't have the language. But because he did that, the best friends that we ever made, we made because the parents that drove the kids ended up becoming close friends of ours to this day. So I say BBYO, BBG, the Jewish community, it connects us all. It really does.
Truly. Thank you for sharing about all of those experiences, how unique and special to hear those. I wondered if you could tell me some about once you came back to the States and started working at JFS, and then maybe we can move into talking about not to be sour for the rest of the time, but to talk about Harvey and then to talk about COVID.
Yeah. So while I was in France, I got a call from Suzanne Jacobson, who works for the Federation, and we've known each other for 45 years at least. And she said, Linda, a job just opened in Houston. It's the head of the American Jewish Committee, their office. And, you know, these jobs don't open, and I know you'll be coming back in the year. I think you should apply for it. And I have to tell you, I had to study for that job. I really had to research it. There's a lot of things that weren't in my bailiwick at all, but I did. And I came back to the States for an interview, and they hired me. And so before we were literally back in Houston full time, I started working for AJC, the Houston chapter. And one of the things they said to me is, we kind of hesitate to hire you because if one of those bigger jobs opens in the community, you'll go for it and we'll be left holding, you know, the towel. And I said, well, let me make a phone call. And I called Lee Wunsch, who was the head of the Jewish Federation. And I said, Lee, are you planning to leave the Federation anytime soon? And he said, no, the stock market's been awful. You know, I wanted to totally retire at a certain age. It's not going to happen. I'm here for a while. That's all I needed to know. Thank you. So I called back AJC and say, there's no other job I want in the city that I would choose to go for. So this is good. So I went to work for them, and I did love my job. And I learned a lot. I mentioned Nostra Aetate earlier as being significant when I was young. Well, one of the big things that happened while I was AJC was he came out with the Passion of the Christ film. And all the Jewish communities around the country were up in arms about it. And there was a local guy named, Leo Lindbeck, from a very wonderful Catholic family, who was asked by Mel if he could bring the film to Houston. And he said, well, my best friend is Jewish, so the only way I'll say yes is if you let the Jewish community come. And his best friend is a man named Stephen Grabart. So Stephen and his dad worked hard to make sure they could choose 30 members of the Jewish community to go. And when I was invited and some members of AJC, I said, you know, I don't know enough about passion plays and about all of this. I would like to bring in the national expert from AJC to brief us. And so we created this morning briefing before the film. And this Rabbi James Rudin, who is the expert, came and helped us all understand so we could see it not through Jewish eyes, but through Catholic eyes and what it is that they were feeling and seeing. And we went. And when we got there, we had to sign a non-disclosure that we would not speak to the press or anybody about what we saw. And we signed it, of course. You couldn't go in if you didn't. But as soon as we came out, another local organization was standing there speaking to the Chronicle and going on. And of course, then my guy, Rabbi Rudin, said, I'll get in so much trouble in New York if I don't also speak. I said, you made a promise. We made a promise. The answer's no. And I pulled people out of there and we did not speak. So what we got out of that was a group was started of Jews and Christians, not all Catholics, some came from other backgrounds, that met together monthly for a long time in a dialogue group to try and get to understand each other's point of view. And it was at such a high level, and it was so great. And at the end of the day, Dennis Prager happened to be in town and he's a radio co-host and a pretty outspoken person. And he came, and at 11 o'clock at night, our group got together and he interviewed everybody about the dialogue and what was happening in Houston, Texas, and how Jews and Christians and Catholics were getting together and trying to understand what this meant to each group. And so we actually won a really amazing national award for all the work. I ended up not being interviewed by the New York Times, but briefing the reporters for the New York Times so they would know the kind of questions and the way to go about their interviews. I mean, it was just an incredible thing. And AJC got, they also got a lot out of it, because we didn't speak that day right when we came out. And so, it's hard sometimes. It's really hard, but it was. We made lifelong friends, and I think understanding, which is really important. Suzanne Jacobson called me one day. You heard that name like 3 times in this interview. And she said, Linda, there's a job opening up and it has your name all over it. And to be perfectly honest with you, and I've shared this story publicly, so I'm not saying anything. When she said, Mary Jean Weston is going to tell her board tomorrow that she's moving to New Jersey and they're going to have to find a new person for the head of Jewish Family Service. And it's your job, Linda. It's your job. It has your name all over it. And you need to see yourself there. So I burst out laughing and I said, Suzanne, number one, I made a commitment to the American Jewish Committee that I wouldn't leave, in a short period of time. So it had just been about 3 years. Number two, JFS says no. When people need help, my experience is they say no. Now, why do I have that experience? Because when I worked at the Federation, if somebody went to JFS for help and it didn't fall within the services and programs they were offering at that time, they would tell them, call the Jewish Federation. And I would call the Jewish Federation and I would get the call and I would listen to the story and I'd say, oh my God, well, that's why we give money to Jewish Family Service. You have to call them. No, they told me to call you. So that's what I mean about it was just a place that the work they were doing was excellent. It's not a comment on the quality of the work. It was on the scope of the work because what the community needed was significantly more than it had been able to offer. And I think it took 3 to 4 months for me before I actually said yes to interviewing. And I made them meet me I said, find a place that nobody you've ever seen goes there just to even talk to me about it because I don't know. And then before I interviewed, I went to my AJC president and said, I've made some commitments to AJC and so I'm prepared to stick to it, but I need to tell you what's on my plate. And I got, the blessings from everybody locally that no, this was probably the right thing for me to do. And so, I have not looked back. I would say the first few months, as I was trying to figure it out, I had my master's in social work. I do not have my master's in counseling, social work counseling. I am like the program evaluation, the macro person who can see, and drive you towards a vision. But I am not the one that has any licenses to help you through individual problems and therapy. So in some respects, it was good because I couldn't step on it. I was just going to listen to everybody and follow what they had been doing. And just so many opportunities came my way. So I had a lot of opportunities to help JFS grow and to become the agency it is today. I don't think anybody would answer no. Today, if someone called for services, they might say, that's a service we don't offer, but I can help you find the right place and I will make the connection for you. But they would not turn somebody away. So we are, who we are. In 2015, after Memorial Day, we had that 11-inch rain that really flooded Meyerland out in particular, some other parts of the city, but it really impacted Meyerland. And I learned previous to that sometimes you need to say yes when you need help. So if I could just say to you that Hurricane Katrina that happened in 2005, when I started to work at the JFS, Katrina had happened. I was hired when it happened, but I didn't come on board till November. And our work in the beginning was very much a response to Katrina and learning lessons from Katrina. And some of the lessons that we learned were the kinds of things that we applied immediately to the Meyerland floods. And so I can't say that everything we learned was in 2015. I think we learned a lot in 2005. Have a plan, evacuate, tell people where you're going, share. We always partner with the Dallas JFS. They start taking our calls a day or two before a storm comes, so that if people are trying to evacuate or they need help and we're busy shutting down the building or moving things or stuck somewhere, we know that our folks are getting answered and responded to. We learned a lot from that. And then Meyerland happened, Memorial Day floods happened. And then we said, yes, we need help. And I said yes to anybody, any other JFS in the country, if they were willing to send somebody down here to help us. We took them up on it. In hindsight, the Memorial Day floods were a drop in a bucket compared to what happened all along the way. But I think it's one really important lesson for anybody who's operating an organization is to know when to say, yes, I need help. We need help, and we're willing to take you up on it. So that was a really important lesson. By the time Harvey came around, we really were the experts. And one thing that happened from Memorial Day to Harvey, Memorial Day, JFS was really the central address for responding, and the Federation and JFS weren't working hand in glove exactly at that moment. We're kind of just doing what we needed to do where we were. And after it was, of course, they raised a lot of money. We were able to help financially assist a lot of people. We did work together, but it wasn't a smooth and lean operating machine. By the time Harvey came, we had figured it out, and the Federation took the lead in terms of communicating to the entire community, in terms of bringing people in from other cities to help, coordinating, and just letting JFS go and do the work for basic assistance to individuals and families. And when COVID happened, we took that exact same model and said, Federation will raise the money and deal with issues, and JFS is going to focus on the people who need the help. And we work as one team, and that's, I think, one of the most important lessons out of all of it. We learned a lot of good things and a lot of bad things. So Harvey, by the time people were hit by Harvey, they also may have flooded up to 6 times total. And individuals in middle age to early seniors may have already gone through a lot of their savings to try and take care of rebuilding themselves. People who were not accustomed to turning for help and would never have thought to do it were then going into their IRAs or retirement plans. And so by the time COVID hit, quite frankly, the wells are dry and they haven't had the time they need to rebuild them or replenish them. So I have real concerns for the long-term health of our financial well-being of our Jewish community, particularly for seniors. And JFS is so in tune to that. And we're trying so hard with our partners to keep people afloat. And honestly, we would rather than come to us before it's a crisis than after. If you come to JFS for help because you now have an eviction notice, and that's because you've been late 4 times, well, if you'd come to us the first time, you never would have been late, right? And we would have been working with you to figure out what do you need to do to get whole again. I mean, I wish we could afford to hold everybody up for the rest of their lives, but I know that's, it's not possible. So then we have to help people figure out, what resources do I have? How do I redeploy them? What can I do to replenish them? If I can't, what do I have to do? Do I have to downsize? Do I have to go into a different living scenario? These are things we'd much rather talk about before it's a major crisis. So, we have a disaster team started in 2015, and we've never been able to let people go from the disaster team, particularly since Harvey. And so one of the reasons our COVID response was so immediate and quick is because I still had the Harvey people doing Harvey work. And one area, for example, for Harvey, we hired a trauma-informed therapist. And we said, even though Harvey will be long gone, the trauma from being in that flooded home will not be. And with storms coming and going our way, we need a therapist that will be there for at least 5 years. So we're in that 5-year period, and we still had that trauma-informed therapist who now we've asked them to continue for the next 3 to 5 years, because the trauma across our population is significant, and we understand that it doesn't go away just because you don't see COVID anymore, or you don't see the rain. I will tell you, we've had between a 300 and 500% increase in requests for counseling, and the mental well-being is in significant danger in our community right now. And gratefully, I always say that in the world of JFS, the inverse is true. When everything out there looks financially scary and businesses have to pull back, it's exactly when JFS has to increase their services and their work. And that's just where we are. I don't play an accordion. I don't even know. I've never held one. But I always think about when it's closed, that it's like in its home position. And then when the person starts, playing it and the music starts coming out, they're expanding and contracting. And that's what I think is JFS's job, to expand and contract, and God willing, get to that home base as often as we can when things are calm and cool and stable. But when they're not, we're just that accordion player finding the right place. That's who we are.
Thank you. That's so wonderful. A great metaphor. We've worked through everything that I expected us to and all the questions I have, but I wanted to make some space for you to say anything else that you feel like is important, or that I haven't asked about, or that you'd like to expand on from earlier.
So just a few things. First place, I reread the family history essay I wrote in 1975. And to be perfectly honest, I was just shocked at the 20-year-old me who had such strong opinions and and voice them in a way that I guess a 20-year-old would. So, I would say that one thing that we know as time goes on, wisdom begins to prevail. And the Jewish community, I think, we have to think of it in those terms as well. These times right now, these days, are very fraught with anxiety and stress and lots of questions. Will the future of the synagogues, come back after everyone's been virtual for the high holidays and for the last 7 months? Will young Jewish adults choose to support our institutions in the ways that we have built them? What will Judaism look like when today and yesterday and God willing tomorrow, we continue to welcome people of all backgrounds as Jews by choice into our fold? And so, as we project, we have to remember that there were stressful times in each generation, and there were always people thinking there'll never be a strong Jewish community. Oh my God, my grandmother started serving bacon, at some point because the doctor told her to. The world's coming to an end. Who will be Jewish if that happens? And all these things, they happen, and they're just part of the wave of tapestry that we are as a community. And so, whether if someone's listening to this, I hope that what they'll find is hope and resiliency, and understand that each Jewish community in their time frame it in ways that we never thought of before that. And so I have so much faith in my children and grandchildren and your generation and everybody who comes along, that the Judaism that will be, it may not look like the Judaism I grew up with, but it's going to be the best it's supposed to be in those days. And we're just part of this amazing chain. And I used to think that sometimes we break the chain, but the truth is I think we open the chain to let more people in. And so, we're just an amazing people, and I'm so grateful that I was called to do this work, and that I'm able to live a life of purpose and meaning and passion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It was beautiful. And thank you for sharing your family story and for sharing this special day of your mother's yard feet with me.
Yeah, I think she would be so happy. I think it would make her so happy to know that her family tree was alive. She had a wonderful childhood, loved it, and she would be very happy for us to be remembering it.